Prose poetry is poetry written in prose instead of using verse but preserving poetic qualities such as heightened imagery, parataxis and emotional effects. Characteristics: prose poetry should be considered as neither primarily poetry nor prose but is essentially a hybrid or fusion of the two, and accounted a separate genre altogether. The argument for prose poetry belonging to the genre of poetry emphasizes its heightened attention to language and prominent use of metaphor. On the other hand, prose poetry can be identified primarily as prose for its reliance on prose's association with narrative and on the expectation of an objective presentation of truth, history. Prose poetry originated in early 19th century France and Germany as a reaction against dependence upon traditional uses of line and verse. Earlier examples can be found in Western literature, for example James Macpherson's translation of Ossian. German Romanticism may be seen as forerunners of the prose poem as it evolved in Europe. At the time of the prose poem's establishment as a form, French poetry was dominated by the Alexandrine, a strict and demanding form that poets starting with Aloysius Bertrand and later Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud and star copyright Fane Mallarmé copyright rebelled against in works such as Gaspard de la Nuit, Paris Spleen and Les Illuminations. Gedicht in Prosa. Von der Romantik bis zur Moderne. Poet und Auswahl von Alexander Stillmark, Frankfurt a. Main. Germany and Austria throughout the 19th century produced a large body of examples of prose poetry without using the designation. The prose poem continued to be written in France into the 20th century by such writers as Max Jacob, Henri Miclaur, and Francis Punge. At the end of the 19th century, British decadent movement poets such as Oscar Wilde picked up the form because of its already subversive associations. Writers of prose poetry outside of France include Friedrich R. Paragraph-Luglin, Novalis, Hans Christian Andersen, Rainer Maria Rieck, Stefan George, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, Meitling, Turgenev, Kafka, Georg Trakl, H. P. Lovecraft, and Clark Ashton Smith. Notable modernist poet T.S. Eliot wrote vehemently against prose poems. He added to the debate about what defines the genre, saying in his introduction to Juna Barnes' highly poeticized 1936 novel Knighthood that this work may not be classed as poetic prose as it did not have the rhythm or musical pattern of verse. In contrast, a couple of other modernist authors wrote prose poetry consistently, including Gertrude Stein and Sherwood Anderson. By Grand Central Station I Sat Down and Wept by Canadian author Elizabeth Smart, written in 1945, is a relatively isolated example of English-language poetic prose in the mid-20th century. Then, for a while, prose poems died out, at least in English until the early 1950s and 60s, when American poets such as Allen Ginsberg, Bob Dylan, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, Russell Edson, Charles Simic, Robert Bly and James Wright experimented with the form. Edson worked principally in this form, and helped give the prose poem its current reputation for surrealist wit. Simic won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for his 1989 collection, The World Doesn't End. At the same time, poets elsewhere were exploring the form in Spanish, Japanese and Russian. Octavio Paz worked in this form in Spanish in his Aguila o Sol. Spanish poet Angel Crespo did his most notable work in the genre. Giannina Broi, postmodern Spanish-language poet, wrote a trilogy of prose poems, El Imperio de los +Os. Translator Dennis Keane presents the work of 6 Japanese prose poets in the Modern Japanese Prose Poem, an anthology of 6 poets. Similarly, Adrian Warner and Carol Emerson described the form's growth in Russia in their critical work, Russian Minimalism, From the Prose Poem to the Anti-Story. The writings of Syrian poet and writer Francis Marash featured the first examples of prose poetry in modern Arabic literature. In Poland, Bolesław Prus, influenced by the French prose poets, had written a number of poetic micro-stories, including Mold of the Earth, The Living Telegraph, and Shades. His somewhat longer story, A Legend of Old Egypt, likewise shows many features of prose poetry. The form has gained popularity since the late 1980s. Journals have begun to specialize, publishing solely prose poems flash fiction in their pages. In the UK, Stride Books published, in 1993, an anthology of prose poetry, A Curious Architecture. Some contemporary writers who write prose poems or flash fiction include Michael Benedict, Lee Blackmore, Robert Bly, J. Carl Bogart, Anne Carson, Graham Birchall, Kim Ching-kwee, Stephen Dunn, Russell Edson, Philip A. Ellis, Richard Garcia, Ray Gonzalez, Kai McCohan, Lynn He-Jinian, Mark Jarman, Louis Jenkins, Campbell McGrath, Sheila Murphy, Naomi Shibnai, Mary Oliver, Alan Baker, Ian Seed, Steve Spence, Linda Black, John Olson, Marge Piercy, Bruce Holland Rogers, David Shumate, James Tate, and J. Marcus Weekly, Ron Silliman, Robin Spriggs, Thomas Willoch, Jason White-Marsh, W. H. Pugmire, and Gary Young. See also, poetry, foo, flash fiction, Heerban, lyric essay, vignette, double room, The English Male Coach, Suspiria de Profundis, notes. References, Robert Alexander, C. W. Truesdale, and Mark Vins. The Party Train, a collection of North American prose poetry. New Rivers Press, 1996. Michelle Delville, The American Prose Poem, Poetic Form and the Boundaries of Genre. Gainesville, Florida, University of Florida, 1998, Stephen Friedman, Peter Unregistered trademark as Prose, The Crisis in American Verse. 2nd ed. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1990. Ray Gonzalez, No Boundaries, Prose Poems by 24 American Poets. Tupelo Press, 2003. David Lehman, Great American Prose Poems, From Poe to the Present. Simon & Schuster, 2003, Jonathan Monroe, A Poverty of Objects, The Prose Poem and the Politics of Genre. Ithaca, New York, Cornell University Press, 1987. Margaret S. Murphy, A Tradition of Subversion, The Prose Poem From Wilde to Ashbery. Amherst, Massachusetts, The University of Massachusetts Press, 1992. Zygmunt Sikowski, Twa-cubed Rux or Ebola Sa or Prusa, 2nd ed., Warsaw, Pour Stwow Institut Wydornishi, 1972. External links, The Prose Poem, an international journal produced by the Berkeley Electronic Press, Poetic Form, Prose Poem, William Stafford and David Shumate describe prose poetry, elsewhere an online literary publication and archive of prose poetry.